Get out of our village, beast!
She took the boy. Don't let her leave.
The road to Brook Hollow had not seen an orc in years. After the war ended, the border between human lands and the scattered orc clans had grown quiet. Traders passed through again, farmers rebuilt their fences, and people slowly began pretending that the bloodshed of the past decade had never happened. But memories didn't disappear that easily, especially in small villages. The first person to notice her was old Brenner, the blacksmith. He stood outside his forge early that morning, hammering a bent horseshoe back into shape when he saw the tall figure walking down the dusty road. At first he thought it was just a traveler. Then the sunlight hit Green's skin. The hammer slipped from his hand and clattered against the stone floor. "Orc," he muttered. The word spread quickly. Within minutes the quiet morning of Brook Hollow changed. Shop doors creaked open. Farmers paused in the middle of the road. Women carrying baskets of vegetables stopped walking and stared. By the time the stranger reached the wooden bridge leading into the village, nearly 24 people had gathered to watch her approach. She didn't slow down. She didn't look nervous. But she didn't look confident either. The orc woman walked with the steady exhaustion of someone who had traveled a very long way. Dust clung to her boots and the edges of her dark cloak. Her long black hair had been tied back loosely, and the leather pack slung across her shoulder looked nearly empty. She carried no weapon. That alone confused the villagers. Mayor Calder pushed his way through the small crowd and stepped onto the road. "Stop there." The orc woman obeyed immediately. She halted just before the bridge and looked at the gathering villagers with calm, steady eyes. They stared back, some with anger, some with fear, most with suspicion. No one had expected to see an orc walk openly into Brook Hollow. Not after the war. "What do you want?" the mayor asked. His voice carried the hard edge of a man who had spent years protecting his village from raids. The orc woman spoke quietly. "Work." The word surprised everyone. Mayor Calder frowned. "You expect us to believe that?" "Yes." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "That's ridiculous. She's probably scouting the village, or waiting for more of her kind." The orc woman didn't react to the whispers. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides. Mayor Calder crossed his arms. "You walked all the way into a human village looking for work." "Yes." "Why here?" "Because the war ended." That answer didn't seem to satisfy anyone. Tomas, one of the young hunters, stepped forward. "The war might be over," he said sharply, "but that doesn't mean we trust your kind." The orc woman nodded slightly. "I know. Then why come?" For the first time she hesitated. "Not long. Just long enough for the villagers to notice. Because I need somewhere to start again." The words hung awkwardly in the air. Brook Hollow was not a large village. People knew each other here. Strangers were rare. Orcs were unheard of. Mayor Calder rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Do you have a name?" "Yes." "Well, Lethra." The mayor studied her carefully. "You fought in the war, didn't you?" "Yes." The honesty caught him off guard. Most travelers tried to avoid that question. Lethra didn't. She answered it like it was simply a fact. The mayor gestured toward the villagers behind him. "Half the people here lost family in that war." "I know. And you still thought coming here was a good idea?" "No." The crowd stirred uneasily. "No," the mayor repeated. "No. Then why come at all?" Lethra took a slow breath. "Because I heard humans rebuild things after wars." The answer made several villagers laugh bitterly. "Yes," Tomas said. "We rebuild our homes, and our farms, and our lives." His eyes narrowed. "But we don't rebuild them with orcs." The crowd nodded in agreement. Mayor Calder pointed back toward the road she had come from. "You should leave." Lethra didn't argue. She simply nodded once. "I understand." Then she turned to go. The villagers watched her walk away. Some looked satisfied. Others looked relieved. To them, the problem had solved itself. But someone else had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching the entire exchange. Elias Rowan, a farmer who rarely spoke unless necessary. He looked at the road, then at the tired figure walking away, then back at the village. And for the first time that morning, someone began wondering if sending her away was a mistake. Lethra had almost reached the far end of the bridge when she heard the voice behind her. "Wait." She stopped. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. No one in Brook Hollow had sounded particularly interested in speaking with her. but the footsteps behind her were real. Slow. Steady. She turned around. The villagers were still gathered near the square, watching the road the way people watched a dangerous animal leave their land. But one man had stepped away from the crowd. He walked across the bridge toward her without hesitation. Lethra studied him carefully. He wasn't dressed like a soldier or a village guard. His clothes were simple and worn from work in the fields. Dirt still clung to his boots, and his sleeves were rolled up the way farmers often wore them. He looked ordinary, but the villagers behind him looked nervous. "Elias," someone muttered. "Where is he going?" The man stopped a few paces away from Lethra. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, she noticed something unusual. He wasn't staring at her the way the others had. Most humans looked at orcs with open hostility or cautious fear. This man simply looked curious. "You said you were looking for work," he said. His voice was calm. "Yes." The villagers behind him began whispering again. "Is he serious? He can't be." Elias glanced briefly toward the crowd before looking back at her. "What kind of work?" Lethra hesitated. "Anything. Farming? Yes. Carrying timber? Yes. Repairing fences? Yes." Her answers came quickly. Elias rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "My south field needs clearing." The words seemed to travel slowly through the air. Then the entire village erupted. "You can't be serious. Elias, have you lost your mind? That's an orc." Mayor Calder stepped forward angrily. "Elias Rowan, what exactly are you doing?" Elias didn't turn around. "Hiring help." The mayor stared at him. "You're not hiring an orc. She asked for work. That doesn't mean we give it to her." Elias shrugged slightly. "I need the help." The mayor's patience was already thin. "Your farm has survived 20 years without orc labor. It's also survived 20 years of war," Elias replied. "That doesn't mean we trust the enemy." Elias finally turned toward the crowd. "She walked into the village alone. That doesn't make her harmless. She asked for work. That doesn't make her honest." The argument echoed across the wooden bridge. Lethra stood silently between them. She had expected rejection. She had not expected someone to argue on her behalf. Elias looked back at her. "You still want the job?" The question surprised her. She searched his face carefully. "Why?" The farmer seemed confused. "Why what? Why offer it to me?" Elias thought for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Because the south field still needs clearing." "That's not what I meant." "I know." She studied him carefully. Humans rarely did things without reasons, especially when it involved helping someone they considered an enemy. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "You asked for work. That doesn't mean I deserve it." Elias tilted his head slightly. "That's not how work usually works." Behind them, the villagers continued arguing loudly. Mayor Calder raised his voice above the noise. "This is not happening." Elias sighed and turned toward him again. "She'll stay on my farm." "That's not the point." "What is the point?" "The point," the mayor snapped, "is that you are inviting trouble into this village." Elias folded his arms. "Trouble walked away 5 minutes ago." He gestured toward Lethra. "I'm the one who asked it to come back." The mayor stared at him. "You're responsible for whatever happens next." Elias nodded calmly. "That seems fair." The argument died down slowly as the villagers realized something important. Elias Rowan was stubborn. Once he made up his mind, convincing him otherwise was nearly impossible. Mayor Calder sighed heavily. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe." The mayor pointed toward Lethra. "If she causes problems, she leaves." Elias nodded once. "Deal." The mayor turned back toward the village, clearly frustrated. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but many of them kept looking over their shoulders at the strange pair standing on the bridge. Elias looked back at Lethra. "My farm's about a mile south." She didn't move. "You're serious?" she said quietly. "Yes." "You'd really give me work?" "Yes." Lethra glanced toward the villagers who had just rejected her, then back at the man offering her a place to start again. Her voice softened slightly. "I thought humans only offered orcs blades." Elias shrugged. "Most do. Why don't you?" He looked toward the fields stretching beyond the village. "Because someone has to start rebuilding eventually." Then he turned and began walking toward the southern road. After a moment of hesitation, Lethra followed. The farm sat at the far edge of Brook Hollow where the fields stretched wide and quiet beneath the open sky. It was a simple place. A small wooden house with a slanted roof, a weathered barn leaning slightly to one side, and several long fields surrounded by rough stone fences that had clearly seen better days. When Elias and Lethra arrived, the afternoon sun hung low above the hills, casting long golden shadows across the land. Elias tied his horse to the fence post and gestured toward the wide field behind the barn. That's the south field. Lethra followed his gaze. The land was covered with thick weeds and broken branches. Old tree stumps poked through the ground like jagged teeth, and scattered stones made the soil uneven. It had clearly been abandoned during the war. "You want this cleared?" she asked. "Yes. That will take weeks." "I know." Lethra studied the field again. "I can start now." Elias raised an eyebrow. "You've been walking all day. That doesn't mean I'm tired." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly what it means." Lethra said nothing. Instead, she stepped toward the field, dropping her pack beside the fence before walking into the tall weeds. Elias watched her for a moment. Then he leaned against the fence and crossed his arms. For the next hour, he said nothing. He simply watched. Lethra worked quietly but efficiently. She moved through the field, pulling weeds by their roots and tossing loose stones into small piles along the edge of the land. Her movements were strong and practiced, not the clumsy work of someone unfamiliar with labor. But something else caught Elias's attention. Every time she reached too far or twisted her arms in a certain way, she winced slightly. Small movements, barely noticeable, but they were there. Eventually, Elias pushed himself away from the fence and walked into the field. "You're doing that wrong." Lethra didn't look up. "I'm clearing the weeds." "You're hurting yourself." "I'm working." Elias crouched beside one of the stone piles she had made. "You flinch every time you lift your left arm." Lethra froze. Only for a moment. Then she continued pulling weeds. "It's nothing. Doesn't look like nothing. It's old." Elias studied her more carefully now. The sleeves of her worn tunic were rolled up slightly from the heat. That's when he saw them. Thin white scars ran across her forearms like pale lines etched into green skin. Not random scratches. Not accidents. They were too straight. Too deliberate. Elias frowned. "You get those in the war?" Lethra didn't answer immediately. The wind moved softly across the field. Finally, she said quietly, "Yes." Elias leaned back on his heels. "Battle wounds?" "No." That answer surprised him. "Then what?" Lethra slowly pushed her sleeve down over the scars. "Training." Elias frowned deeper. "What kind of training leaves marks like that?" The silence stretched longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different. "Harder. The kind where they teach you to stop hesitating." Elias understood immediately. Soldiers learned many brutal lessons during war, and some armies were far worse than others. "You were forced into it," he said. Lethra didn't look at him. "That's how most wars work." "You didn't answer the question." Her hands tightened slightly around the weeds she was pulling. "I fought because they told me to." "That's not the same as wanting to." "No." The word came out almost like a whisper. Elias studied her carefully. "You didn't like killing." The weeds in her hand snapped. "No one likes killing." "That's not true." Lethra stood slowly. For the first time since arriving at the farm, she looked directly at him. "You think humans enjoy war less than orcs?" Elias shrugged slightly. "I think most people pretend they don't." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Pretend?" "Yes." He gestured toward the village in the distance. "Half the men there still tell stories about the battles like they were great adventures." Lethra looked away toward the horizon. "I never told stories." "Why not?" "Because I ran from the last battle." The words almost left her mouth, but she stopped herself. Instead, she said, "Because I survived them." Elias didn't push further, but the question lingered in his mind. Because scars like the ones on her arms rarely came from simple training. They came from punishment. Or worse. As the sun dipped lower over the hills, Lethra returned to clearing the field. Elias watched her silently for a while longer. Something about the way she worked felt familiar. Not just disciplined. Haunted. And for the first time since bringing her to the farm, Elias Rowan realized something important. The orc woman working in his field wasn't just hiding from the village. She was hiding from her past. By the third day, the entire village of Brook Hollow was talking about the orc. In a place as small as Brook Hollow, news traveled faster than the wind across the wheat fields. By morning, every farmer, shopkeeper, and hunter knew that Elias Rowan had taken an orc woman onto his farm, and most of them didn't like it. At the village well, two women filled their buckets while whispering quietly. "I saw her yesterday," one said. "The orc?" "Yes. She was clearing the south field." The other woman frowned. Elias must be desperate for help. Or foolish. Nearby, the baker leaned out of his shop window. Foolish doesn't begin to describe it. Across the square, Tomas the hunter listened to the conversation with growing irritation. He had never liked Elias much. The farmer was too quiet, too stubborn, and far too comfortable ignoring what the rest of the village thought. Now he had brought an orc into their lives. Tomas spat into the dirt. This won't end well. By midday, the whispers had grown louder. Some villagers claimed the orc was scouting the area. Others insisted she was pretending to be harmless until the rest of her clan arrived. Fear had a way of creating stories, and Brook Hollow had spent too many years living in fear. Meanwhile, life on Elias's farm continued quietly. Lethra had already cleared nearly half of the south field. The work was brutal, but she didn't complain. She simply moved from one section of land to the next, pulling weeds, lifting stones, and chopping away stubborn roots with steady determination. Elias watched her from the barn doorway while repairing an old wagon wheel. "You're making the rest of us look lazy," he called out. Lethra paused briefly to wipe sweat from her forehead. "You hired me to work." "Yes. So I work." Elias chuckled softly. "Fair enough." The peaceful moment didn't last long. A group of riders appeared on the road leading toward the farm. Elias recognized them immediately. Villagers. And judging by the expressions on their faces, they weren't here for a friendly visit. Tomas rode at the front. Behind him were 4 other men from Brook Hollow, all carrying hunting bows or axes. Lethra noticed them too. She straightened slowly but didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't have one. The riders stopped near the fence. Tomas swung down from his horse first. "We need to talk," he said. Elias leaned against the barn wall. "You rode all this way to say that." Tomas ignored the comment. "This has gone far enough." "What has?" "You know exactly what." Tomas pointed toward the field where Lethra stood. "That." Elias followed his gaze calmly. "She's clearing weeds." "She's an orc." "Yes. And she's living on your farm." "Also true." The other villagers shifted uncomfortably. One of them finally spoke. "People are worried." "About weeds?" Elias asked. "About her." Elias crossed his arms. "She hasn't caused any trouble." "Yet," Tomas snapped. Lethra walked slowly toward the fence, stopping a few steps behind Elias. She didn't speak. She simply listened. Tomas noticed her approaching. His voice hardened. "You should leave." Lethra looked at him calmly. "I have work here. You're not welcome here." "That decision was not yours." Tomas's face reddened. "You think because Elias gave you a job, the rest of us will accept it?" Lethra didn't answer. Elias stepped forward slightly. "If you came here to threaten my worker, you wasted the ride." "This isn't about threats," Tomas replied. "It's about protecting the village." "From what?" "From the enemy." Lethra finally spoke. "The war is over." Tomas laughed bitterly. "You think war ends just because someone signs a piece of paper?" He gestured toward the village. "Half the men here buried brothers because of your people, and half of mine buried brothers because of yours," Lethra replied quietly. The words silenced the group for a moment. But Tomas wasn't ready to stop. "The council is meeting tonight," he said. Elias frowned slightly. And they're going to decide whether you're allowed to keep her here." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Allowed?" "Yes. This is my land. You're still part of the village." Elias sighed. "I had hoped people would mind their own business. That stopped the moment you brought an orc into it." The riders began turning their horses around. But before leaving, Tomas looked back at Elias. "You should think carefully about what you're doing." "Why?" "Because by tomorrow." His eyes flicked toward Lethra. "You might have to choose between your farm and your new friend." The riders disappeared down the road, leaving dust swirling in the afternoon sunlight. Lethra stood quietly beside Elias. "You should send me away," she said. Elias didn't look at her. "Why?" "Because they will make you." Elias stared out across the field she had nearly finished clearing. Then he said something that surprised her. "We'll see about that." That evening, the sky over Brook Hollow turned dark earlier than usual. Heavy clouds rolled in from the western hills, swallowing the last light of the sun and leaving the valley beneath a thick blanket of shadow. The wind carried the distant smell of rain, and the fields around Elias's farm grew quiet as night settled in. Inside the farmhouse, a small lantern burned on the table while Elias repaired a broken harness strap. Across the room, Lethra sat near the window sharpening a rusted farm blade he had given her earlier. Neither of them spoke. The conversation from earlier that day still lingered in the air. Finally, Elias broke the silence. The council will probably talk a lot tonight. Lethra didn't look up. About me. Yes. They will decide I should leave. Probably. She continued, sharpening the blade slowly. You should let them. Elias glanced at her. You seem very certain about that. I know how these things end. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and stretched his arms before walking toward the door. Come on. She looked up. Where? Barn check. Lethra frowned slightly, but followed him outside. The wind had grown stronger now, rustling the tall grass around the farm. The clouds overhead were thick enough to hide the moon, leaving the yard dim except for the faint lantern light spilling from the house. The barn stood at the edge of the field where the newly cleared land stretched out dark and quiet. Elias opened the large wooden door. Inside, several goats and 2 old horses shifted lazily in their stalls. Just making sure everyone's still alive, Elias said. Lethra nodded. They moved through the barn quietly, checking the animals and securing the stalls against the coming storm. That's when Lethra smelled it. Smoke. Her head snapped toward the back wall of the barn. Elias. What? Do you smell that? He sniffed the air. A faint burning scent drifted through the barn. Elias's expression changed instantly. Fire. The word had barely left his mouth when flames suddenly licked up along the far side of the barn wall. Someone had stuffed burning straw into the wooden boards. The dry wood caught quickly. Within seconds, the flames began spreading. Damn it, Elias muttered. The goats started bleeding in panic. The horses kicked their stalls nervously as the fire crackled louder. We need water, Elias shouted. But Lethra was already moving. She rushed toward the first stall and kicked the gate open. Get them out, she yelled. Elias grabbed a bucket and ran toward the well outside while Lethra dragged the frightened goats out of the barn one by one. The fire spread faster than either of them expected. The back wall began glowing orange as flames climbed the wooden beams. One of the horses screamed and slammed against its stall door. Lethra ran toward it. Easy, she whispered. The animal kicked wildly, terrified by the heat and smoke. Lethra forced the latch open and pulled the horse out just as part of the burning wall collapsed behind them. Outside, Elias returned with a bucket of water and threw it against the base of the flames. But it barely slowed the fire. Someone set this, he said angrily. Lethra didn't answer. She ran back inside. Wait, Elias shouted. But she was already gone. The second horse was still trapped. Thick smoke filled the barn now, making it hard to see. Lethra wrapped a piece of cloth over her mouth and pushed through the smoke toward the stall. The horse thrashed violently. Calm down, she whispered. Her hands worked quickly on the latch. It stuck. The heat from the flames was unbearable now. The roof beams creaked loudly above her. Finally, the latch broke open. Lethra grabbed the horse's reins and pulled. The animals stumbled forward, nearly knocking her down as they rushed toward the exit. They burst out of the barn just as another section of roof collapsed behind them. Elias grabbed the reins and pulled the horse away from the burning building. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The barn fire roared behind them, lighting the night sky with flickering orange flames. Then Elias noticed something strange. Lights were appearing on the distant road. Villagers. They were running toward the farm. When they arrived, they stopped suddenly at the sight in front of them. The barn was burning. The animals were safe. And standing beside Elias, covered in ash and smoke, was the orc they had all wanted gone. Tomas stared at the scene in disbelief. You saved them? He asked. Lethra looked at the burning barn. I work here. The barn burned for nearly an hour. By the time the flames finally died down, the storm clouds had opened and rain poured across the valley. The downpour helped smother the last of the fire, leaving only a blackened skeleton of wood and smoke rising into the night sky. Villagers stood in the mud around Elias's farmyard, staring at the damage. Most of them had come running when they saw the fire from the village. Some had brought buckets. Others had simply come to watch. Now the rain soaked their clothes while they studied the scene in uneasy silence. The barn was destroyed, but the animals were alive, and everyone knew why. Lethra stood near the fence, her clothes covered in soot and ash. Rain washed streaks of black down her arms as she stared at the ruined building. Elias walked over to her. You okay? She nodded slowly. Yes. You went back in there. Yes. That roof almost collapsed on you. I noticed. Despite everything, Elias smiled faintly. Across the yard, Tomas kicked a charred board in frustration. This didn't just happen, he muttered. Several villagers nodded. Someone said it. I smelled the burning straw. Mayor Calder stepped forward, his face dark with anger. Whoever did this nearly burned down the entire farm. His eyes moved across the gathered villagers. Does anyone want to explain why Elias's barn suddenly caught fire tonight? No one answered, but the silence itself felt suspicious. Some villagers looked away. Others shifted uncomfortably. The mayor sighed. This is exactly the kind of trouble I warned about. Elias folded his arms. The only trouble I see is someone trying to destroy my farm. That may be true, Calder replied. But you know why it happened. His gaze drifted toward Lethra. The meaning was obvious. Tomas crossed his arms. People are scared. Scared enough to burn down a barn full of animals? Elias asked. No one answered that. The rain continued falling harder now, drumming against the ground. Lethra finally spoke. You should not blame them. Everyone looked at her. You almost died in that fire, Elias said. Yes. And you're defending the people who said it? I understand them. Tomas frowned. You understand someone trying to kill you? Lethra shook her head slowly. I understand fear. The words carried across the quiet yard. Mayor Calder studied her carefully. You risked your life to save those animals. Yes. Why? She looked at the burned barn. Because they were trapped. That's it. Yes. The mayor didn't seem satisfied. You could have run. Yes. But you didn't. No. Elias glanced at her. Some people here still think you're dangerous. Lethra lowered her eyes slightly. Maybe they are right. That answer confused everyone. Tomas frowned. What's that supposed to mean? For a long moment she said nothing. Then she slowly pushed back the wet sleeve of her tunic. The pale scars on her arm were clearly visible now under the lantern light. Thin white lines. Straight. Deliberate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mayor Calder's expression hardened. Those aren't battle wounds. No. Then what are they? Lethra took a slow breath. They were punishment. The yard fell silent. Punishment for what? Tomas asked. Her voice was steady but quiet. For refusing an order. What order? The rain continued pouring around them as she finally spoke the truth she had been hiding. My commander ordered us to burn a village. Several villagers stiffened. Human villages had been destroyed that way during the war. And you refused, Elias said quietly. Yes. What happened next? The mayor asked. They beat me. Her fingers traced one of the scars. Then they tried again. And I refused again. The silence grew heavier. Finally Tomas spoke. So you deserted? Yes. And ran? Yes. The rain washed the last of the ash from her arms. Mayor Calder looked troubled now. You understand what desertion means to an army? Yes. Your people would hunt you for that? Yes. And you still came here? Yes. Tomas stared at her. You're telling us you walked into a human village? Because your own people would kill you? Lethra nodded once. Yes. The rain fell harder around them. For the first time since she arrived in Brook Hollow, the villagers were not looking at her like an enemy. They were looking at her like something else. A survivor. Elias finally broke the silence. You refused to burn innocent people. Yes. And now someone here tried to burn you. Lethra looked at the ruined barn again. That is how war follows people. The villagers stood quietly in the rain. Because suddenly, the orc working in Elias's field didn't look like the monster they expected. She looked like someone who had already lost everything. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn. By morning, a cold mist hung over the fields around Elias's farm. The burned remains of the barn stood like a black skeleton against the gray sky, smoke still curling faintly from the charred beams. The village had returned to its usual routines. But the tension had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown worse. Word about the fire and Lethra's past had spread through Brook Hollow overnight. Every house now carried the same conversation. The orc who saved the animals, and the orc who had once refused to burn a human village. Some people felt sympathy. Others felt even more uneasy. Because if her own people considered her a traitor, that meant trouble could follow her anywhere. Late that morning, Elias stood in the field stacking stones Lethra had cleared the day before. Lethra worked nearby, quietly cutting away the last stubborn roots from the soil. Neither of them mentioned the barn. Neither of them mentioned the council. But both knew what was coming. Around midday, the sound of horses approached again. Elias didn't even look up this time. Let me guess, he muttered. The council. Lethra stopped working. 5 riders approached along the road. Mayor Calder led them. Behind him rode Tomas and 3 other villagers who had been present during the fire. The horses slowed as they reached the edge of the farm. Calder dismounted first. "This won't take long," he said. Elias leaned against his shovel. That's usually what people say before long conversations. The mayor didn't smile. "We held the council meeting last night. I assumed you would." Tomas crossed his arms. "And we reached a decision." Elias nodded toward the burned barn. "Let me guess. You're blaming the fire on her." "No," Calder said. "That was never proven." "Good. But the problem remains." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What problem?" Calder gestured toward Lethra. "Her." The word hung heavily in the air. Elias looked at the mayor calmly. "She saved the animals." "That's not the issue." "She refused to burn a village during the war." "That's not the issue either." "Then what is?" The mayor sighed. "The issue is that fear is spreading." "Fear was already here," Elias replied. "Now it's worse." Tomas stepped forward. "People think more orcs might come looking for her." "They might. And if they do?" Elias shrugged. "Then we deal with it." "That's easy for you to say." Tomas snapped. "This is your farm. And your village," Elias replied calmly. The argument simmered for a moment before Calder raised a hand. "Enough." He turned toward Elias. "The council has made its decision." Elias waited. Calder's voice was firm. "The orc must leave." Lethra lowered her gaze slightly. Elias didn't react. Calder continued. "If she leaves peacefully, this ends here. And if she doesn't, then we remove her." Tomas nodded firmly. "That's the only way the village stays safe." Elias rested both hands on the shovel handle. "You're afraid?" "Yes." "Of one person?" "No," Calder said quietly. "Of what follows her." The wind moved through the fields around them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Elias looked toward Lethra. "You hear that?" "Yes." "You want to go?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said softly, "I do not want to cause trouble." Tomas pointed toward the road. "Then leave." Lethra turned slowly toward the distant hills. For the second time since arriving in Brook Hollow, she prepared to walk away. But Elias suddenly spoke again. "No." Everyone turned toward him. Calder frowned. "No." Elias looked directly at the mayor. "She stays." The words landed like thunder in the quiet field. Tomas shook his head. "You don't get to decide that. It's my land. You're still part of the village." Elias nodded. "Yes. And the council's decision applies to everyone." Elias leaned the shovel against the fence. Then he said something that stunned them all. "Then I guess I'm not part of the village anymore." The words hung in the air. Calder blinked. "What?" Elias looked around at the fields he had worked for years. "My farm sits outside the village boundary." "That's not the point." "It actually is." Tomas stared at him. "You'd leave the village for an orc?" Elias shook his head. "No." He glanced toward Lethra. "I'd leave it for the right decision." The silence that followed felt enormous. Mayor Calder finally spoke again. "You understand what this means?" "Yes." "You won't have the council's protection. I've survived worse. You won't be welcome in Brook Hollow anymore." Elias shrugged. "That's unfortunate." The mayor sighed heavily. "Very well." He turned toward his horse. "You've made your choice." Elias nodded calmly. "Yes." The riders mounted again. Before leaving, Tomas looked back at Lethra. "You should hope he's worth it," he said bitterly. Then they rode away. The field grew quiet again. For a long moment Lethra simply stared at Elias. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. Elias picked up the shovel again. "Probably not. You lost your place in the village." "Maybe." Lethra studied him carefully. "Why?" Elias looked out over the half-cleared field. Then he gave the simplest answer he could. "Because you deserved a chance." The farm felt different after the council left. Not quieter. Brook Hollow had always been a quiet place, but heavier somehow, like the air itself carried the weight of what had just happened. Elias worked the rest of the afternoon without saying much. He finished stacking the stones from the south field and began clearing the burned remains of the barn. Charred beams cracked as he dragged them aside. The smell of smoke still lingered in the damp morning air. Lethra helped without being asked. She lifted broken planks, hauled debris into piles, and moved silently across the yard like someone trying not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled between them. But eventually the silence grew too heavy to ignore. "You should not have done that," she said quietly. Elias didn't look up from the beam he was dragging. "Done what?" "Chosen me over the village." "I didn't choose you." She frowned slightly. "You left them." Yes. Because of me. Elias dropped the burned beam into the pile and wiped his hands on his coat. No, he said. Because they were wrong. The word surprised her. You lost your home. No. Elias replied calmly. He gestured around the farm. My home is still here. But the village was never the important part. The wind moved softly through the empty barn frame behind them. Lethra looked toward the road leading back to Brook Hollow. You will need supplies. Yes. Tools. Yes. People. He shrugged slightly. Maybe. She shook her head. You cannot run a farm alone. I'm not alone. The answer confused her. There is only me here. Elias leaned against the fence. Yes. That is one person. That is two people. Lethra stared at him. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood. You are joking. I rarely joke about farm work. She crossed her arms. You cannot mean that. Mean what? That I stay. You already work here. That was before. Before what? Before you abandoned your village. Elias sighed. I didn't abandon them. They abandoned you. That depends on how you look at it. Lethra shook her head again. You should find a human worker. Why? Because humans trust humans. And orcs trust orcs. Yes. Elias looked out across the fields thoughtfully. That system hasn't worked very well so far. Lethra studied him carefully. You are serious. Yes. You would really keep me here. Yes. Even after everything. Yes. She hesitated. Then she asked the question that had been growing in her mind since the council left. Why? Elias looked at the half-cleared field she had worked on for days. You cleared more land in 3 days than I managed in 2 months. That is not a reason. You saved the animals. That is not a reason either. You refused to burn a village during the war. Lethra's eyes lowered slightly. That should not make me special. It does. She was silent for a long moment. You are risking everything for someone you barely know. Elias shrugged. Most partnerships start that way. Lethra blinked. Partnership? Yes. You mean work? Yes. That is not what partnership means. Elias smiled faintly. It does on a farm. She looked uncertain. You are offering me a place here. Yes. Not as a servant. No. Then what? Elias pushed himself away from the fence and walked toward the cleared field. He pointed across the land. Half this farm is abandoned. Lethra followed his gaze. Yes. The barn needs rebuilding. Yes. The fields need planting again. Yes. Elias looked back at her. I can't do that alone. The meaning of his words slowly settled in. You are asking me to stay. Yes. To help rebuild your farm. Yes. She hesitated again. You know the village will hate this. Probably. They may never accept me. That's their problem. They may never accept you again either. Elias shrugged. I've survived worse things than gossip. The wind moved through the fields again. For the first time since arriving in Brook Hollow, Lethra felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not suspicion. Possibility. You would really trust an orc with your land? She asked quietly. Elias looked around at the damaged farm. Someone has to start rebuilding. Then he said the words that changed everything. You didn't come here just for work. Lethra frowned. No. No. You came here for a future. The words hung in the quiet air between them. Elias met her gaze calmly. Well, he said, I'm offering you one. For several days after the council's decision, Brook Hollow kept its distance from Elias's farm. The road that once carried carts of grain and neighbors stopping to talk had grown strangely quiet. People still traveled past the fields, but they avoided looking toward the rebuilt fence or the smoke rising from Elias's cooking fire. To the villagers, the farm had become something uncomfortable, a place where the old rules had been broken. But life on the farm continued. Slowly, patiently, Lethra spent the mornings working the soil of the south field she had cleared. The earth was rough and stubborn after years of neglect, but she turned it carefully, preparing it for planting. Elias focused on rebuilding the barn. The fire had destroyed most of the structure, but the stone foundation remained strong. Day by day, he replaced burned beams and stacked new timber, slowly raising the skeleton of the building again. Neither of them talked much about the village anymore. They simply worked. But one afternoon, everything changed. Dark clouds rolled across the valley faster than anyone expected. A heavy wind swept down from the mountains, bending the tall wheat fields and sending loose leaves spinning through the air. Elias noticed it first. He stood on the half-built barn frame and looked toward the sky. That storm's moving fast. Lethra followed his gaze. The clouds were thick and angry, and they were heading straight toward Brook Hollow. Within minutes, the wind grew violent. Thunder rolled across the hills as the first heavy drops of rain struck the ground. But the storm brought something worse. Lightning. A bright flash tore across the sky and struck somewhere near the village. A second later, smoke began rising. Elias climbed down from the barn quickly. That looked close. Lethra's eyes narrowed as she stared toward Brook Hollow. The smoke thickened rapidly. That was not a small fire. Another bolt of lightning struck somewhere in the distance. The storm was building fast. Without another word, Lethra grabbed the bucket near the well and started running toward the road. Elias followed. By the time they reached the edge of the village, chaos had already begun. Lightning had struck the old grain storehouse near the square. The drywood caught fire almost instantly. Villagers ran through the muddy streets carrying buckets and shouting to each other as flames spread across the roof. The storm made everything worse. Strong winds fed the fire, pushing flames toward the nearby homes. Mayor Calder shouted orders over the thunder. Water line, move faster. But panic had already taken hold. The fire was spreading too quickly. Elias pushed through the crowd. Where's the well line? Over there, someone shouted. He joined the line of villagers passing buckets from the well to the burning building. Meanwhile, Lethra looked at the flames climbing the roof. Something was wrong. The fire wasn't just spreading outward. It was spreading downward. Inside the building. Is anyone still inside? She shouted. No one answered. Then a terrified voice cried out from the crowd. My son. A woman pushed forward through the villagers. He was helping move grain sacks. Mayor Calder grabbed her arm. The building's collapsing. My son is still inside. The crowd froze. The flames were too strong now. No one dared run inside. Except one person. Before anyone could stop her, Lethra rushed toward the burning doorway. Wait! Elias shouted. But she was already gone. The smoke swallowed her instantly. Inside the storehouse, heat and ash filled the air. Burning beams cracked overhead as Lethra pushed deeper into the building. Hello, she shouted. A weak cough answered from somewhere near the back. She followed the sound and found a young boy trapped behind a fallen beam. The child's face was black with soot and fear. Don't move, she said. The boy stared at her in shock. Orc? Yes. The beam was heavy, but Lethra forced it aside with a strained grunt. Can you stand? The boy nodded weakly. She lifted him onto her shoulder just as another section of the roof collapsed nearby. They stumbled toward the exit through thick smoke. Outside, the villagers watched in stunned silence as a figure burst through the flames. An orc, carrying a child. Lethra staggered into the rain and gently set the boy down beside his mother. The woman wrapped her arms around him, crying with relief. For a long moment, no one spoke. Rain poured over the village. The fire slowly died under the storm, and the villagers stared at the person they had feared the most, the orc who had just saved one of their own. Mayor Calder looked at Lethra carefully, then at the rescued child. For the first time since she arrived in Brook Hollow, the village saw her differently. The storm passed during the night. By morning, the sky above Brook Hollow had cleared, leaving the village quiet and washed clean by the heavy rain. The burned grain storehouse still stood in the center of the square, its roof half collapsed and its walls blackened by smoke, but the fire had not spread to the nearby homes. The village had been lucky, very lucky, and everyone knew why. Word of what happened traveled faster than any rumor had before. People spoke quietly while repairing fences, sweeping water from their doorways, or gathering near the well. The orcs saved him. She ran straight into the fire. I saw her carry the boy out. The story repeated again and again until no one in Brook Hollow could pretend they hadn't heard it. By midday, Mayor Calder rode out to Elias's farm. This time he came alone. Elias was working near the rebuilt barn frame when he saw the mayor approaching. Well, Elias said as Calder dismounted, that's either very good news or very bad news. Calder glanced at the rising barn structure. You work quickly. Someone has to. The mayor studied the farm quietly for a moment. The cleared field, the stacked timber, the signs of rebuilding. Then he finally spoke. The village owes you both an apology. Elias raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. Calder nodded slowly. I spoke with the boy this morning. And he says the orc pulled a burning beam off his legs before carrying him out. Elias smiled faintly. That sounds like her. The mayor looked toward the field where Lethra was working. She was turning the soil again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened the night before. She could have run, Calder said quietly. Yes, but she didn't. No. Calder exhaled slowly. Fear makes people blind. Elias leaned against the fence. You don't have to convince me. The mayor looked uncomfortable. The council was wrong. That happens. We judged her too quickly. Yes. We judged you too quickly as well. Elias shrugged. I'm used to that. Calder hesitated. Then he said the words Elias hadn't expected. The council would like you to return to the village. Elias laughed softly. Already. The situation has changed. Because she saved someone. Yes. That's convenient. Calder didn't argue. People saw something last night they didn't expect. An orc risking her life for a human child. Yes. The mayor looked back toward Lethra. She reminded us that the war is actually over. Elias nodded. Sometimes people need proof. Calder stepped closer. You're both welcome back. Elias considered the offer carefully. Then he shook his head. No. The mayor blinked. No. This farm still needs rebuilding. That doesn't mean you can't be part of the village again. Elias smiled slightly. We never stopped being part of it. Calder studied him carefully. Then why refuse? Elias looked across the fields. Because change takes time. The mayor followed his gaze. What do you mean? If we come back now, Elias said, people will pretend nothing happened. But something did happen. Calder nodded slowly. Yes. Elias looked toward Lethra again. She didn't save the boy to prove anything. No. She did it because it was the right thing to do. Yes. Elias pushed away from the fence. So we'll stay here for now. The mayor thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. That might actually be better. He mounted his horse again. But the village will want to visit. Elias chuckled. They're welcome. As Calder rode away, Elias walked out toward the field. Lethra paused in her work when he approached. The mayor came, she said. Yes. Am I being sent away again? No. She studied him carefully. What did he say? Elias looked across the open farmland surrounding them. He said the village wants us back. Lethra frowned slightly. And Elias shrugged. We have work to do first. She nodded slowly. Then she looked out over the fields that still needed planting and the barn that still needed finishing. You still believe this place can become something? Yes. And you still think I belong here? Elias smiled faintly. I think we're building something better than what was here before. Lethra looked at the land again. For the first time since she walked into Brook Hollow expecting rejection, the future didn't feel uncertain anymore. It felt possible. And sometimes, that was all it took to start something new.